Association of South Africa says it wants answers from the Public Investment Corporation regarding its knowledge of the troubles surrounding VBS Mutual Bank. Early this week, the Reserve Bank placed VBS under curatorship. The PIC is the second majority shareholder in VBS with a 27% stake.
The Public Servants Association of South Africa, which invests about 200,000 members' pension funds in the PIC, says it is concerned about the role of the PIC in the VBS matter. It says it wants answers from the PIC and has cautioned it not to invest more money into VBS.
PIC should have realized earlier that VBS was experiencing difficulties, and they should have been more careful in as far as the GPF investments in those kinds of companies are involved.
Troubles at VBS began when the bank learned that municipalities are not allowed to invest in mutual banks. At that time, VBS says it was in the process of registering as a commercial bank, which would have allowed it to take deposits from municipalities. Governor Lesetja Kganyago told reporters that it was highly risky for the bank to take sizable municipal deposits that were not short-term and lend them out long-term. This and the fact that by law, mutual banks cannot take deposits from municipalities prompted the Reserve Bank to take steps. But the Reserve Bank has been heavily criticized for this move, with some saying curatorship should have been the last resort.
The main function of the Reserve Bank is to actually regulate. As a regulator, then nothing stops them from assisting this bank to make sure that they obtain their license and support them in the sense that it's also creating a notion that our bank supports their own.
Wits economist Professor Yanni Rousseau says placing VBS on curatorship is the best route, as any other option would have to be liquidation of the bank, and this would have a negative impact on the depositors.
The bank should never have taken those deposits, so the compliance officer of VBS Bank really gave bad advice to the board and management of VBS Bank. The taking of deposits from municipalities, municipal structures, that is simply illegal, and you cannot allow a bank to trade under illegal conditions. So VBS Bank had instructions to get rid of these deposits. And of course, by getting rid of these deposits, you put the bank's liquidity position in serious jeopardy.
Meanwhile, economist Klanti Bai says the application of laws should be critical in the advancement of the people.
Part of the communication has been very, very poor. The standpoint of our regulators, to me, has come up as rather harsh, if not actually almost like a level of callousness or arrogance that, we are here, we've got the authority, rather than to say, how do we use our authority, how do we use our powers to assist, to get things done.
The Black Management Forum says it is of the view that it is an opportune time for the Reserve Bank and the National Treasury to move faster and act on an observation made by the Portfolio Committee on Trade and Industry and the Standing Committee on Finance. These committees believe that National Treasury and government shape policies too much on the basis of globalized financial systems and too little on the specific requirements of the country. National Treasury says it is never the intention of the Treasury for any bank to be liquidated, particularly a small black-owned bank.
The decision announced by the South African Reserve Bank Governor Lesetja Kganyago to put VBS Mutual Bank under curatorship has drawn mixed reactions from various stakeholders. The action was reportedly triggered by VBS's inability to achieve sufficient liquidity following National Treasury's instruction to municipalities that they stop investing with the bank and then withdraw their funds. Some applauding it as good oversight and governance, while others have warned that this could deter the development of black owners in the space. Kaya Setole, you may not know it, but he is actually a chartered accountant. I speak to him very regularly as with his hat as a political analyst on there. But Kaya, it's good to have you, and I'm looking forward to my conversation with you with regard to this. Well, first up, what did you make of all of this when you heard this being revealed?
Well, it was quite disappointing, because you would have thought that obviously banks are such highly regulated entities for one to end up in curatorship, it means that a series of missteps have happened over time. And the reality here is that the banking oversight system in South Africa is so strict. Every month, every single bank sort of submits its financial statements to the Reserve Bank. So at every point in time, they know exactly what is going on in a particular bank. So for them to end up having to put one under curatorship invites us to ask the questions at what point did things start going wrong, and what did the Reserve Bank do when things started going wrong before we even get to the point of curatorship? Because for me, that's what I'm still trying to figure out.
You're struggling to understand it. Okay, well, I'm sure people at home are struggling to understand a lot more. In fact, I think they probably want to know, what does curatorship mean? And so let's go to the basics. What happens when you're put under curatorship?
So essentially, this is a second last step, if one might call it. What happens here is that you appoint a board and the management of a particular bank, and they're supposed to run the bank in a way that ensures that, of course, whenever people want to come and withdraw their money, they're able to do so. So what then happens here is that if it turns out that those individuals are deemed or seen by the Reserve Bank not to be able to fulfill that particular mandate, then the Reserve Bank steps in and says, we'd like to remove you and would like to put someone else in charge. And that person is then given the mandate of then stabilizing the bank. So what this person will simply do is that they look at the cash flow patterns, they look at whose money is in the bank, who's expecting a withdrawal and all of those things, who owes the bank, and then they'll obviously then try and contact those people and say, look, this is the status of the bank, this is how much money you can withdraw if you've got a deposit with us, and if you owe us, please can you pay us back on the terms and conditions that you stipulated. So it's essentially a new person who takes over the running of the bank until it reaches some form of stability. And then of course then the Reserve Bank then says, okay, now that the bank is stable, we can then consider handing it back to its original owners.
Okay, so if we get a basic understanding, I mean, you look at a bank like VBS, that is very much so, I suppose, historically a community bank. So communities put their money in there, and when they need loans, you go in, and it works as a community bank. And yet we got to a point where municipalities were putting their money in. And I mean, this took, I imagine, the balance sheet from here through the ceiling. What happened there? I mean, how did it get to a point where municipalities were actually allowed to deposit their money into this bank?
Well, according to the Municipal Financial Management Act, municipalities are actually not allowed to invest their money in any bank that is not registered in terms of the Banks Act.
Okay.
So this being a mutual bank, it actually is regulated by the Mutual Banks Act rather than the Main Bank Act of 1990. So my suspicion here is that there was the idea that, VBS is going to migrate and move its regulation from the Mutual Banks Act onto the Banks Act. And of course, if that turns out to be the case, it means that the municipalities would then be allowed to put their money into VBS Mutual Bank, and then perhaps as a consequence of timing that didn't materialize. So even today they're still not registered under the Banks Act, which means that those municipalities that did put their money into VBS then did so illegally, because then quite simply the regulatory framework didn't allow them to do so. But I suspect that there was them trying to think that, well, in the short run this will be sorted out, but reality is that it's not an easy process to then actually get registered under the Banks Act. It could take up to 18 months according to the Governor of the Reserve Bank. So I think that was the oversight there, where people sort of started acting prematurely in putting their funds there when they really shouldn't have.
I'm trying to find a tweet while I'm speaking to you that you did. You actually spoke to the CEO of VBS Bank. What did he say? I mean,
I spoke to the chairman on Sunday morning. Yeah,
Talk to me about this.
I was just trying to get some insight onto really what the status was. So of course he had issued a letter on Friday afternoon that was then leaked to the City Press. So the City Press actually ran the story on the Sunday morning. So I was following up on that to say, well, is this actually true, and what is really the status of affairs? And it did say that, actually this is what will be happening later on in the day. So I sort of wanted to find out how we ended up there. And of course all it did was just forward me the letter, and then that's when we started connecting the dots. Okay,
and the dots have been connected now, because there's also a lot of talk behind the scenes. I'm seeing headlines coming out this morning that even the EFF are saying that the bank is now being punished, because we must remember that this is the bank that gave our former president, Jacob Zuma, the home loan for Nkandla. I think it was 7.8 million.
7.8 million.
Somewhere around there. So, political wranglings happening there as well. I mean, they say the bank's being punished for that. There must be more to this.
No, I wouldn't think that the bank is being punished for that particular loan, because in that instance, then the bank itself will be able to say, look, everything that we've done is absolutely above board. There's nothing that we've done wrong, so are we being punished? So if that was the case, I think the bank itself would come out and say, actually, we think we're being treated unfairly. They haven't said this at this stage, because I don't think anyone is disputing the fact that the municipalities did put their money into a mutual Mutual Bank. Now, the bigger question is, should we then revisit the regulatory framework that then prohibits municipalities from putting the money into that bank? For me, that's the more important question. And I think politically, the fact that they got elevated into the public space simply by granting a loan to the former president is not really the type of thing that has led us to here. It might have influenced perceptions, but I don't think it's what then drove the Reserve Bank to then say, we're going to put you under curatorship. Keep in mind that curatorship is actually done in order to save the bank.
Okay.
Liquidation is when you actually then say, no, everything must collapse.
Yeah.
So in this instance, you're simply saying, we think the bank can be rescued, but we believe that the management as it is right now are probably not fit for purpose. We want new people to come and rescue the bank, and then once the bank is rescued, then it will be good for business again.
Yeah, well, let's see what happens there. I have to wrap the interview, but I can't not draw a parallel here. This Ramaphoria we are talking about, and we're seeing the story of VBS Bank. We're now also seeing the Bank of Baroda. Some clients not happy that they're leaving the country and they would like to see them stay. What do you think is happening? I mean, very quickly in this landscape, this banking landscape, we've also got Barclays. I'm not sure if I can throw them into the equation, but ABSA, Barclays, Bank of Baroda, VBS Mutual. Give me your views. I think
we are sort of moving into a territory where people are being very, very vigilant about how they're conducting their practices. And of course, if you remember, the Bank of Baroda have been the primary bankers to the Gupta family for a very long time. And of course, that is inevitable that you'll then suspect them of money laundering and state capture activities. So what you're seeing here is that everybody's then trying to sort of disentangle themselves from as much of the mess of the previous 9 years as they can. So I think the Bank of Baroda actually then decided to withdraw its own license to circumvent a court order which had said that they must actually keep the accounts of the Guptas open until there's another court order. So they simply said, well, we're no longer available in the country, so you can't expect us to serve as a client in the country when we're no longer there. So I think that's part of that whole state capture manifestation. I think the VBS conversation is probably just the regulators then saying that actually we think that it's time to pull the plug on this, because the reality is that this didn't start yesterday. The municipalities did not invest their money yesterday. It's been going on for quite a while. And the question that we failed to ask the Reserve Bank governor is, why did you let it happen in the first place? Because even the very first rand that was deposited into VBS was technically illegal. But of course, the Reserve Bank seems to have let that go. They seem to have let it slide until now. And the bigger question is why?
That is the million-dollar question. It really is. I love talking to you, Kaya. Thank you. Thanks for coming in and just giving us a little bit of clarity. And it helps having Kaya in studio. He is, as he explained to me as he sat down, a recovering chartered accountant. Is there a therapy group that you have to go to get over it?
It's not in Parktown.
Not in Parktown, okay. Kaya Sithole talking to us here in his capacity as a chartered accountant. He's a very big political activist, analyst as well, and talking to us about the Reserve Bank's decision to put the VBS Mutual under curatorship and the court's decision yesterday to allow the Bank of Baroda to leave the country. We'll continue analysing this after the break. Do stay tuned.